Happy New Year and welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world, with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Now, Mr. Churchill described the former Soviet Union as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. If so, North Korea has to class as the most mind-twisting Rubik's Cube, wrapped inside a paradox. The most secretive country on the earth has much to be secret about. Surrounded by hostile nuclear-armed bases, sometimes known as countries, Japan and South Korea, which have previously invaded, leaving up to 1/3 of all North Koreans dead, and all within the lifetime of many watching this. So, no wonder North Korea has adopted the porcupine approach and bristles with many sharp spears. Thus, it will never be invaded again, or so we hope. Power has passed, apparently seamlessly, from the great leader Kim Il-sung to the dear leader Kim Jong-il, and now to his younger son Kim Jong-un. I say apparently seamlessly because recently there has been a very domestic difficulty involving the young-un and his uncle, although they're keen to point out that Uncle Jang is not only factionalist filth and human scum, he never actually really was an uncle. Joining me now to make sense of all this is Britain's foremost China and North Korea expert, Keith Bennett, who with me more than a decade ago was responsible for the establishment 50 years after we invaded Korea of diplomatic relations between the two countries. Keith, very good to see you again. Let's start with this question of the uncle. They say actually he wasn't an uncle. Tell us how.
Well, in Korean terms, the way they understand family relations, he wouldn't be regarded as an uncle because he's not a blood relative of Kim Jong-un. He was married to Kim Jong-un's aunt, the sister of Kim Jong-il, although it's also understood that the two of them had not been living together for some years up to now.
So close but no cigar as such. But it is nonetheless quite an extraordinary turn of events. Every country has factional problems, including our own, but they don't always lead to someone being executed, even in North Korea. Did they deal with them harshly? How serious were the crimes that he committed?
You've made a very interesting point in that these things don't always end up this way in North Korea. In fact, you have to go back to the 1950s before you can find anything remotely comparable to what's happened. And of course, in that time, many officials have come up, they've been promoted, demoted and dismissed. And indeed, Jang himself was dismissed from all his posts on at least 2 previous occasions over the years, and subsequently was brought back and given another chance and even given more power. It is, on the face of it, a very harsh outcome, but it is actually an unusual one. I think it seems very harsh in a European context. As you know, there's only one country left in Europe that still maintains the death penalty, although if there was a referendum in this country, I think you and I both know the way that the popular vote will go on that particular one. But the death penalty, on the other hand, is endemic in much of the rest of the world, not least the United States of America. And the United States government, which obviously loses no opportunity to attack and denigrate the government in North Korea, said that the execution of Jang illustrated the brutal and inhuman nature of the regime there. Now, that's all very well, but this is the same US administration whose Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, quite probably the next Democrat candidate for president, was able to gloat at the very public lynching of another head of state, Muammar Gaddafi, saying that we came, we saw, he died. So I think you have to put some of the international reaction into that context. As for the crimes, he was, of course, accused and found guilty of treason, and at least according to the official reports admitted the crimes. It was said that he tried to get more and more of the national economy under his control, with a view to wrecking the economy, ruining the people's living standards, and ultimately staging a coup. These this would obviously be considered treason in any country, and particularly in North Korea, which, as you said, rightly sees itself as being in a state of siege with a situation still outstanding from the Korean War, which finished in 1953 only with an armistice and still no peace treaty.
Of course, many people's only interest in Korea, unlike yours and mine, is whether or not the situation's stable. This is a nuclear-armed state with a huge military, and so the question arises, is Kim Jong-un securely in power?
Well, that's an inevitable question after what's happened, but the fact that it has happened and things are going on, to me, gives greater credence to the idea that things will be more stable now than they were hitherto. Certainly, since the purging of Chiang, Kim Jong-un has kept up a very hectic program of all sorts of public engagements, and everything else in Pyongyang has been business as normal. One
of his now regular visitors is a good friend of mine, Dennis Rodman, the giant American basketball player. He seems to have fallen in love with North Korea. Tell us.
He does, and I guess that North Korea sometimes has that effect on people, not least because the reality of the country, and although like every country it has its problems, but the reality of the country is not the same as the hostile media presentation. And indeed, sometimes the hostile media presentation does people a favour when they go there, because maybe their expectations are so low that things are inevitably a lot better than what they were expecting. But I find that Dennis Rodman, Kim Jong-un relationship, friendship indeed. Dennis Rodman famously said on his first meeting to a full stadium, you have a friend for life, and he seems to be keeping to his word. I find that friendship very interesting on a number of levels. It certainly shows that from the top in North Korea, from the very top, and contrary to what we are told in the West, that certainly, at least on a people-to-people level, North Korea is open to having normal and indeed friendly relations with other countries, including the United States of America. Another thing it feeds into is a long history of a relationship between African Americans and North Korea. Kim Il-sung, the present leader's grandfather, was a great friend of the Black Panther Party. And it also shows Kim Jong-un is very interested in sports, we know that, but it shows a great appreciation of the fact that sport can be used to break down barriers and build international understanding. We all know about that, how Nelson Mandela used that with the Rugby World Cup, thanks to the film Invictus. We can recall the ping-pong diplomacy that opened the door to relations again between the United States and China. And some viewers will remember the 1966 World Cup, where at least in Middlesbrough, the North Koreans were a huge hit among ordinary English people.
I'm sorry to tell you, I remember it only too well. They beat Italy 1-0. They were 3-0 up against Portugal before the great Eusebio overhauled that, and Portugal ran out winners in the end. But the North Korean football team in 1966 at the World Cup were a huge hit.
But aren't the ladies' team of the football in North Korea very good?
Oh, they're excellent. And amongst North Korean men, it seems to be a mixture of half admiration and half, I get a bit of mild jealousy that North Koreans love football, and the fact that they've been in 2 World Cups notwithstanding, they feel, though, that the men are not really such good footballers, but that the ladies are brilliant. The North Korean women's team did exceptionally well in the Asian Cup, and of course they were particularly proud that they beat the United States, which obviously has great resonance. And last year, the ladies football team from Middlesbrough, who all went out, who were all amateurs, went out and played some exhibition and friendship games in North Korea against the North Korean ladies. By all accounts, the Middlesbrough ladies had a fantastic time, and I think the North Koreans are trying to send their ladies back here on a reciprocal visit.
And what about the state of children? What about the education and the health records?
Well, I think if you put this into historical perspective, before 1945, Korea was a Japanese colony, and when Korea was liberated, the country had just a handful of university graduates, so all of this work began from scratch. And the very first factory that was built in North Korea after the Japanese were expelled was a pencil factory, which I think gives an indication of the priorities. North Korea was one of the very first countries, if not the first in Asia, to achieve 100% literacy. And they've always attached huge importance to education and to healthcare. Just 1 year ago, Kim Jong-un made a policy announcement which is in the process of being implemented, which will institute 12-year universal and, of course, free education in Korea. And besides the schooling system, you can go to places like the School Children's Palace in Pyongyang, where some of the facilities that are available for children for after-school activities would really be the envy of Eton and Harrow. Though, of course, not every educational establishment is like that throughout the country, not by any means, but it gives an indication of what they're aspiring to. I think the other context in which we have to put this is that from the mid-1990s onwards, we had a series of economic difficulties in North Korea, which were occasioned by the collapse of the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union and the other East European countries in Comecon had accounted for the overwhelming bulk of North Korea's trade, and many of the inputs in fertilizer and raw materials for their economy were dependent on that. Suddenly that was taken away, and they had a whole series of natural disasters year after year: floods, droughts, typhoons, and so on. And these have inevitably had a negative impact on education and particularly on healthcare. But throughout that time, unlike in other countries, including much wealthier countries than North Korea, education up to university level has remained free, and all types of healthcare have remained free. And the head of the UN World Health Organization, a Chinese lady from Hong Kong, Dr. Margaret Chan, did a very interesting report on healthcare in North Korea, which is well worth reading, which acknowledges the problems, but at the same time points out that in many respects North Korea still remains a model for developing countries in terms of universal provision of healthcare, which remains something to which they're politically committed, even if there are some problems in delivery at the moment.
Well, Keith, we're going to have to leave it there, but it's time you and I made a return visit to Pyongyang. We'll have to go and check it out. We'll ask Dennis to come with us.
That'll be fun.
We'll have a whale of a time. Keith Bennett, thanks very much for joining us on the Sputnik. After the break, we'll be looking at the strange and sudden death of the world's youngest country, South Sudan. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. Now, as you know, perhaps I'm not a big fan of breaking up countries, at least not where there is no pressing need to do so. If I believe that Korea is one and should be reunited, and Ireland ditto, it follows that I was a bitter opponent of the partition of Sudan, which in my lifetime was a single country, bigger than Western Europe, and ruled from Westminster, where I have sat for more than 25 years. South Sudan left, taking 80% of the country's oil wealth with it. Other separatist struggles continue in the north. And now South Sudan, the world's youngest country, has itself fallen apart, and the sides are murdering each other with gay abandon, and all on top of one of the world's richest oil fields. Joining us now to discuss the question of what's going on in Sudan is a very bright young man of my acquaint, an academic researcher studying African conflicts, and himself the son of one of the historic leaders of the oldest communist party in Africa, that of Sudan. He is Ahmed Kaballo. Ahmed, welcome to the show. Let's start first of all with South Sudan. It has only just been born. Now it looks as if it might be dead. What's your analysis?
There's divisions in the south that have never really been addressed. And these divisions were instigated by the north for the whole divide and rule policy that they learned from the colonial era. And the actions of the president of South Sudan have tried to take it from the new democracy to a dictatorship. He dismissed his whole cabinet, he dismissed the vice president over a conspiracy of a coup, but there's actually been no evidence of that.
And now there is, effectively, not a coup, but a revolution, led by the dismissed vice president. Who's who and what's what on either side?
Well, the vice president, Machar, is from the Nuer tribe, and the president is from the Denka tribe. The Denka is the most populated tribe in South Sudan, and the Nuer is the second most populated. They've had conflict for over 20 years now. There's been massacres on both sides, and the tension was never really addressed. They had a common enemy, Khartoum, but now that's gone. They're going at each other's throats.
And is it just tribal? Any politics involved?
There is definitely politics involved. It's about power and resources and who can get a piece of the pie. Like you said, Sudan is a very oil-rich country, and in any African state, oil can either be a curse or a gift. And what we're seeing, it's turned out to be the former.
80% of Sudan's oil went with South Sudan. The big oil companies moved in. Other actors, like Israel, for example, keen to cause further problems in the north, moved in heavily into the capital. Is there any big power involvement in this new struggle between these two personalities?
All the big powers supported the separate movement because the oil was there. Yeah. It was obvious. South Sudan is a product of geopolitical differences between China and the United States. China's got its hands in the north. The United States wants to get its hands in the south, and that's why it's been working on separation from around the late 80s. However, the former great leader of the SPLM, John Galloway, didn't want separation. He wanted a new Sudan where people were equal under the law and regardless of ethnicity, tribes and region. However, his untimely death took away that vision.
1 year ago exactly, me and George were in Sudan, in Khartoum and Omdurman, and everything seemed very stable and very beautiful indeed. And now, a few months later, we saw all this unrest going on. And
even in the north, there were bodies on the street. Indeed, we had to help with you and your family get your father out of prison just a few months after we'd left Khartoum. Yeah. What's that all about? If we can understand the split inside the south, what's the split inside the north?
When the south split, it took a lot of the revenue that the north relied on, and that's kind of put a bandage over the deep scar that we've seen in the south, a military dictatorship that's been going on now for over 20 years. And the people are unhappy, they want a new Sudan. The people of my age have seen nothing but a military dictatorship. They've got better visions of a new Sudan, better visions for their children. And there was this political atmosphere, political tension in the air, and all it needed was that spark. And the rise in oil prices, gas prices, price in bread, overnight caused that spark and people were out in the street. And my father was arrested just because he wanted to exercise his right to assembly and to voice his opinion about politics and democratic change. So they arrested him without charge for security reasons. I mean, they arrested absolutely everyone on the street. The prisons were full. Women were away from their children. So effectively, there was no one to be out on the streets protesting. But all it needs is that spark again. All it needs is...
Well, what's the spark going to be? Because I've met the president, Bashir. I must say I found him quite impressive. But he absolutely pledged to me that he would not run again for another presidential term. Is he going back on that now?
He's filled up his pockets, so it's time to move on. He's made his money. There's reported.
There's nowhere he can move on. He's subject to Interpol warrants. He's staying in Sudan. That's all he can do.
But he's still travelling. No one's taking that arrest warrant seriously. No one's took it upon himself to arrest him. He's still travelling freely. He was even talking about going to the United States.
So you think he will keep his promise not to run again? In which case, what happens at the next election?
It's as you like to say, two cheeks of the same backside. If someone replaces him, it'll be the same policy, the same serving the interests of the few, filling up their bank accounts and not working for the interests of the Sudanese people.
Yes, but Bashir has some special talents. He has a certain charisma and he had a certain position in the military and in the sort of paramilitary party which he runs. I'm not sure there's another Bashir. I mean, it seems to me that Bashir will either change his mind and run again because there isn't an alternative, or that when he goes, the dam will break and maybe some kind of revolutionary process will emerge in Sudan.
Well, let's hope so. I mean, I've been waiting for it all my life, for a different Sudan. And I hope you're right. I hope he steps down and the dam breaks and the people rise up and try get some freedom that they haven't seen since the late 80s.
Separation of North and South was one thing, but there are actually a lot of people now fighting to separate themselves out from the rest of the people in the North, places like Darfur and other struggles. Are they really separatist struggles? Do they really want to establish another country, or can this somehow be resolved without that?
I think it can be resolved. The justice equality movement in Darfur actually not asking for a separate state. They're just asking to be involved. All the decisions are made in Khartoum, the resources are directed in Khartoum. They feel left out, marginalised, and it's been going on since the colonial period. They want to be involved, they want the same opportunities that the people in Khartoum get.
People have a vested interest in breaking Sudan up. Do you think that there is any way that the big powers will allow Sudan to remain united?
We need somebody with the same narrative that John Galloway had, the justice equality movement are promoting, of a new Sudan that benefits people. Sudan has long been divided along geographical lines, tribal lines, ethnic lines.
Well, indeed, the British Empire made sure of that.
Yeah.
I mean, they were the first ones to, as it were, bifurcate the country, not in state governance terms.
Like languages.
The people in the south
they were not allowed
to learn Arabic.
Yeah. And there was trade and travel restricted.
Yeah.
There's effectively politically and socially segregated from one another.
So it's a new year. What's going to happen in South Sudan now? I mean, the big powers are trying to bring the fighting under control, they say. The United Nations are involved, even the Marines. The US Marines have been there. Is this going to be all-out war, or will the talks in Addis Ababa somehow bring it under control?
Well, the upcoming peace talks are fundamental for the future of Sudan, South Sudan. They need to put the political differences aside, because if they don't, we could see a bloody civil war like the ones we've seen in Somalia and Congo, and South Sudan could be divided again. Furthermore, beyond the peace talks, there's great challenges ahead for South Sudan. The ethnic divisions that have been prevalent for over 20 years need to be addressed in some kind of reconciliation process. Otherwise, these wars will keep happening over and over again. And South Sudan will change its status from the world's youngest state to the world's youngest failed state.
Ahmed Kaballo, thanks for bringing us up to date on the Sputnik.
Thanks for having me.
Well, now it's your turn through our social media review, coming through our portal RT_Sputnik. Gayatri, what's rattling?
The kitten says, what do you think about Kitchener being on the new £2 coin? Any thoughts?
It's an outrage, and if it had come before Parliament, I would have laid an objection to it. Kitchener wasn't just the butcher of the Omdurman in the Sudan. He didn't just, according to Mr. Churchill, allow his soldiers to dig up the grave of the Mahdi, cut off the head from the skeleton and play football with it. He actually caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of British people in the First World War. I mean, how much blood do you have to actually shed to get yourself on a British £2 coin?
Tykes replies to my question, what is happening in Sudan, says, round up the usual suspects. It's all about oil and arms, exporting countries.
I kind of feel that. I mean, Ahmed was very clear that it's been misgoverned. There's been some damned awful dictators in Sudan, no doubt. But I think that the very sight of such a huge African country with so much potential, and so much potential wealth, and the oil and gas finds underneath it, was just waiting to be picked off by those who make a living, and a really good one, out of breaking such countries up.
You know what I wonder, and some of the tweets as well, where are George Clooney and Angelina Jolie now? Has their contract finished to pop up?
Well, that's a good point, because it became, especially an American celebrity cause, the breakup of Sudan. And a lot of black people, I think, were misled into believing that somehow the conflict in Sudan was between non-black Arabs and black Africans. Whilst all Sudanese are African, most Sudanese are Muslim. And it ought to have been possible for Muslims and Christians and animists to coexist within the same state, especially a state with this potential.
About Korea, Jong-kook says, post-World War II, Korean peninsula partitioned, the South living under US-led imperial design, the North now suffering constant US interference.
Well, it is. I mean, North Korea, no doubt, has also had its share of bad governance. No doubt at all about that. I mean, if this Uncle Jang was so bad, how come Kim Jong-il appointed him to the post in the first place? But there's no doubt that the United States, in killing such a huge number of North Koreans, in putting so many nuclear weapons into Japan, the ancient enemy of the Koreans, has contributed to a siege mentality on the peninsula, at least in the northern part.
Vinny Irish says, I think it's a country run by a dictator, but I do not view him as an imminent threat to the West.
No, there's absolutely no question of North Korea being a threat to the West. The threat is the other way round. But whether Kim Jong-un, with the emphasis on young, age 30, is really in command of events now, we'll have to wait and see. Keith was not ambivalent about that, but he wasn't absolutely certain either, so we'll have to keep a watching brief on that.
Well, that's all the tweets that we've got for this week.
Which is a pity, because that means that's all the time we've got.
Do keep the tweets coming on RT_Sputnik. That's it from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.